At 2:37 a.m. on March 24, 1945, Private First Class Jack Mazie stood in a muddy field near Viersen, Germany, inflating what appeared to be a 30-ton M4 Sherman tank using a portable air compressor that sounded like a lawnmower. The tank was actually rubber and canvas stretched over an inflatable frame, weighing approximately 85 pounds when deflated, capable of being carried by 4 men, and requiring about 20 minutes to fully inflate. When finished, it would look exactly like a real Sherman tank to anyone observing from more than 100 yards away, which was critical because German forces were dug in approximately 1,500 yards distant across the Rhine River, watching through binoculars and calling artillery strikes on anything that looked like a legitimate military target. Macy, a 23-year-old fashion designer from New York who had been drafted in 1943, worked quickly to inflate the tank, knowing that German observers might spot him if he took too long. The air compressor's noise was concerning. It could potentially be heard across the river if wind conditions were wrong. But the alternative was worse. The Ghost Army, officially designated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, had been assigned to create the illusion that 2 full divisions of American troops, approximately 30,000 men with their tanks, artillery, and support vehicles, were massing near Viersen preparing to cross the Rhine. In reality, those 2 divisions were massing 10 miles south near Dusseldorf, where the actual Rhine crossing would occur. The Ghost Army's job was to draw German attention, German reinforcements, and German artillery fire toward the fake concentration at Viersen, while the real assault happened elsewhere. The deception required speed. Macy and approximately 1,100 other Ghost Army soldiers had 12 hours to transform an empty field into what appeared to be a major military staging area. They had 600 inflatable tanks, 400 inflatable trucks, 200 inflatable artillery, pieces, speakers playing recorded sounds of tank engines and troop movements, radio operators broadcasting fake communications, and orders to create visual evidence of 30,000 soldiers preparing for assault. If the deception worked, German forces would concentrate at Viersen, artillery would bombard empty fields filled with rubber tanks, and the real crossing at Dusseldorf would face lighter opposition. If the deception failed, 30,000 American soldiers would walk into concentrated German defenses and casualties would be catastrophic. Macy finished inflating his tank at 2:59 a.m., 22 minutes from start to finish. He stepped back to examine his work. In the pre-dawn darkness, illuminated only by distant flares and artillery flashes, the inflatable tank looked convincing. The rubber surface had been painted to match real Sherman tanks, complete with unit markings, weathering, and tactical numbers. The inflatable treads looked three-dimensional from distance. The gun barrel, reinforced with a metal rod inside the rubber shell, didn't sag. To a German observer, 1,500 yards away looking through binoculars, this would appear to be a real tank. Over the next 9 hours, the Ghost Army would transform the Viersen field into a fake military base so convincing that German forces would bombard it with thousands of artillery shells, divert 2 panzer divisions to defend against the phantom attack, and completely miss the real Rhine crossing happening 10 miles away. The operation would save an estimated 2,000 to 5,000 American lives by drawing German forces away from the actual assault, and it would be accomplished by 100 men whose military training consisted not of combat tactics, but of art school, theater production, radio broadcasting, and advertising design, skills that the Army had initially dismissed as useless for warfare, but which would prove more valuable than battalions of infantry. If you want to see how artists and designers created fake armies that fooled German intelligence for 9 months and saved tens of thousands of lives using inflatable tanks and sound effects, hit that like button. It helps us share these stories of unconventional warfare that worked because nobody expected it. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're diving into the Ghost Army, the most successful deception unit in military history that remained classified for 50 years and whose members were sworn to secrecy until 1996. Back to January 1944 and the creation of an army that didn't fight but saved more lives than most combat units. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was activated on January 20, 1944, at Camp Forest, Tennessee, under command of Colonel Harry Reeder. The unit's mission, classified at the highest levels, was tactical deception, using visual, sonic, and radio techniques to deceive enemy forces about Allied troop locations, strength, and intentions. The concept was unconventional. Most military deception efforts focused on strategic deception at the highest command levels, not tactical battlefield deception that would operate within artillery range of enemy forces. The Army recruited for the 23rd from unusual sources. Instead of seeking combat veterans or soldiers with traditional military skills, recruiters visited art schools, advertising agencies, theater companies, and radio stations looking for designers, painters, actors, sound engineers, and creative problem solvers. The recruits included fashion designers, billboard painters, architects, industrial designers, sound effects artists, and even a magician. Many had been drafted expecting to serve in combat roles and were confused when they were assigned to a unit whose training involved studying camouflage techniques, learning to operate sound equipment, and practicing radio deception. The unit consisted of 4 specialized elements: the 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion, visual deception using inflatable equipment and camouflage, the 3122nd Signal Service Company, sonic deception using recorded sounds, the Signal Company Special, radio deception creating fake radio traffic, and the 406th Engineer Combat Company, security and support. Total strength: approximately 1,100 men, roughly the size of a single battalion, tasked with impersonating entire divisions of 15,000 men each. The visual deception equipment was revolutionary. The inflatable tanks, developed by the British and refined by American engineers, were constructed from rubberized canvas stretched over inflatable frames with internal support structures that maintained realistic shapes when inflated. When deflated, a Sherman tank replica could be folded into a package weighing 85 pounds that 4 men could carry easily. The deflated package fit into a standard duffel bag, meaning one truck could transport dozens of tanks that would occupy an entire field when inflated. The inflation process required portable air compressors, small gasoline-powered units about the size of a suitcase that could inflate one tank in approximately 20 minutes. The compressors were deliberately quieted to minimize noise that might reveal the deception. Each inflatable tank required constant air pressure maintenance because the rubberized canvas leaked slowly over time. Teams would monitor air pressure and add air as needed to keep the tanks looking properly inflated. When inflated using portable air compressors, the Sherman tank replica became a 30-foot long, 10-foot wide, 9-foot tall structure that looked convincingly real from 100 yards or farther. The external surface was painted in authentic military camouflage schemes, complete with unit markings, tactical numbers, and realistic weathering that suggested the tank had seen combat use. The tracks were 3-dimensional rubber moldings that cast proper shadows. The gun barrel was reinforced internally with a metal rod to prevent sagging that would reveal the tank was inflatable. Even the commander's hatch was detailed enough to look functional from observation distance. The inflatable trucks were similarly sophisticated. The standard 2.5-ton cargo truck replica, when inflated, included canvas coverings that could be rolled up or down to suggest loaded or empty cargo beds, realistic tire treads, windshields that reflected light appropriately, and even dummy drivers, inflatable human figures placed in the cab to suggest the vehicle was manned. The artillery pieces, inflatable 155mm and 155mm howitzers, included proper ammunition storage configurations and positioning that matched how real artillery would be deployed in the field. Total inventory: approximately 1,000 inflatable vehicles of various types. The equipment represented an extraordinary investment in what was essentially theatrical props, each piece costing approximately $100 to manufacture, but representing supposed enemy targets worth thousands of dollars. A real Sherman tank cost approximately $44,000 in 1944 dollars. The inflatable version cost $85. But to German observers, both appeared equally real and equally worthy of artillery bombardment. The sonic deception equipment was equally innovative. The 3182nd Signal Service Company possessed sonic projectors, large speakers mounted on half-tracks capable of projecting recorded sounds up to 15 miles under ideal conditions. The speakers were directional, meaning sound could be projected toward enemy positions while minimizing sound toward friendly positions, reducing the risk that Allied troops would hear the deception and become confused about actual unit movements. The sounds were recorded at Fort Knox, Kentucky, using actual military equipment operated in realistic scenarios. Recording sessions involved entire tank companies starting engines, tanks moving across different terrain types, dirt roads, paved roads, mud, gravel, tank formations maneuvering through tactical scenarios, convoys of trucks moving at various speeds and densities, bulldozers, operating, engineers building bridges, and even troops talking, shouting commands, and conducting typical military activities. The recordings captured authentic sounds, the distinctive whine of a Sherman tank's 5-speed transmission shifting gears, the clank of tank treads against road wheels, the squeak of track tension, the rev of engines accelerating, the rumble of multiple tanks idling, the characteristic diesel engine sound of trucks in convoy formation. Professional sound engineers from Hollywood studios were recruited to ensure recording quality met standards necessary to fool professional German intelligence officers who were familiar with how American equipment sounded. The recordings were played through the speakers at night, when sound carried farther and atmospheric conditions allowed sound to travel long distances. Sound carries differently at night due to temperature inversions. Cool air near the ground creates a layer that reflects sound waves, allowing them to travel farther than during daytime, when thermal mixing disperses sound. The Ghost Army exploited this physics by conducting sonic deceptions primarily between midnight and dawn, when German listening posts would hear sounds of tank movements suggesting large-scale repositioning of armored forces. The sonic operators learned to synchronize sounds with visual deceptions. If inflatable tanks were deployed suggesting an armored division in a specific location, sonic operators would play recordings of tanks moving into that location the previous night, creating the auditory history of how those tanks arrived. If the deception suggested tanks were preparing for offensive operations, operators would play sounds of tanks conducting maintenance, refueling, and preparation activities. The temporal sequencing of sounds was critical. German intelligence tracked unit movements over time, so the sonic deception had to tell a coherent story across multiple days. The radio deception was perhaps the most sophisticated element. German intelligence maintained extensive radio intercept networks that monitored all Allied radio communications, plotted the locations of transmitters through direction-finding equipment, and tracked unit movements by following radio call signs and communication patterns. The Germans knew that a division headquarters transmitted differently from a battalion headquarters. Different message volumes, different encryption levels, different operators working different shifts. The Ghost Army's radio operators had to replicate not just the content, but the pattern of communications. The Signal Company Specials operators studied the communication patterns of real units for weeks before impersonating them. They learned each unit's radio procedures, the distinctive sending style of individual radio operators. Every Morse code operator has a unique fist in how they key the transmitter, as distinctive as handwriting, the frequency of transmissions, the typical message, lengths, the encryption methods used, and even the errors that operators typically made. The goal was to create radio traffic so authentic that German intelligence would believe they were intercepting real unit communications. The operators worked in shifts maintaining 24-hour radio schedules that matched real units. If impersonating a division headquarters, they transmitted the volume and type of traffic appropriate to division-level operations, reports to corps headquarters, orders to subordinate brigades, logistics coordination, intelligence updates, and administrative communications. The messages contained real military information, actual unit designations, authentic code words, legitimate operational terminology, but described fake movements and fake positions. German intelligence, intercepting these transmissions, would plot the fake unit in exactly the location and strength the Ghost Army wanted them to believe existed. The 23rd trained for 5 months at Camp Forest, practicing equipment deployment, rehearsing deception scenarios, and developing tactics. The training was met with skepticism from regular Army units. Combat soldiers visiting Camp Forest saw men inflating rubber tanks and practicing radio scripts rather than conducting weapons training or tactical exercises. The Ghost Army was mocked as toy soldiers, the Rubber Army, and artists playing war. Officers from conventional units questioned why the Army was wasting resources on theatrical deception instead of training more combat troops. The prevailing attitude was that the Ghost Army was a foolish experiment that would collapse under the reality of actual combat. The 23rd deployed to England in May 1944, arriving shortly after D-Day, and moved to France in July 1944 to begin operations. Their first mission, Operation Elephant, occurred on July 15–22, 1944, near Saint-Lô. The objective was to make the German defenders believe that the 2nd Armored Division was moving into the area, when it was actually being held in reserve. The Ghost Army deployed inflatable tanks, broadcast sonic deceptions suggesting tank movements, and transmitted radio traffic mimicking the 2nd Armored's communication patterns. The operation was nerve-wracking for the Ghost Army soldiers, most of whom had never been near combat. They set up their inflatable equipment within German artillery range, approximately 5,000 yards from enemy positions, knowing that if the deception was convincing, Germans would shell what they thought was a real armored division. And shell they did. German artillery bombarded the fake positions, destroying several inflatable tanks and trucks, confirming that the deception was working. The Ghost Army suffered no casualties during Operation Elephant. The inflatable equipment absorbed the shelling, while real soldiers remained safely dispersed. But the psychological impact of being shelled while inflating rubber tanks was profound. Operation Elephant succeeded in fooling German intelligence. Captured German documents later revealed that their intelligence officers reported the 2nd Armored Division in the Saint-Lô area, exactly when and where the Ghost Army had created the deception. German forces adjusted their defensive positions to counter the Phantom Division, weakening their defenses in areas where real Allied units were actually attacking. This success gave the Ghost Army credibility. The mockery from conventional units diminished as word spread that the deception had worked. The 23rd conducted Operation Brittany in August 1944, simulating the movement of the entire 6th Armored Division, 15,000 men and hundreds of vehicles, using 1,100 Ghost Army soldiers and inflatable equipment. Again, German intelligence reported the fake division's presence exactly where the deception placed it, and German forces responded by shifting reserves to counter a threat that didn't exist. By September 1944, the Ghost Army had conducted 6 operations with consistent success. The tactics were refined through experience. Inflatable equipment had to be positioned to match how real units would deploy, with appropriate spacing between vehicles, logical tactical arrangements, and attention to details like tire tracks that real vehicles would leave. The sonic deceptions had to match the visual deceptions. If inflatable tanks were deployed, the sounds of tank movements had to be played at appropriate times. Radio traffic had to be maintained 24 hours a day to sustain the illusion that a real unit was operating. The Ghost Army also learned to create supporting evidence of troop presence. They wore the shoulder patches of the units they were impersonating, visited local towns where they would be seen by civilians who might report to German intelligence, and deliberately left evidence like empty ration boxes with unit markings. They painted unit insignia on their vehicles, created fake command posts with appropriate signage, and even staged recreational activities like baseball games that suggested large numbers of troops in the area. Operation Bettenburg in September 1944 demonstrated the sophistication of Ghost Army tactics. The mission was to convince Germans that the 5th Armored Division and 90th Infantry Division were moving into Luxembourg near the German border, threatening a thrust into Germany. The Ghost Army deployed inflatable tanks and artillery, broadcast sonic deceptions, transmitted radio traffic, and sent teams into Luxembourg City wearing 5th Armored and 90th Infantry patches. The teams visited bars, restaurants, and shops, deliberately mentioned their units in conversations with locals, and created visible presence. The deception worked perfectly. German intelligence reported both divisions in Luxembourg preparing for offensive operations. German forces reinforced their border defenses opposite the Phantom divisions, pulling troops from other sectors. Meanwhile, the real 5th Armored and 90th Infantry were attacking 50 miles away, facing lighter opposition because Germans had moved forces to counter the Ghost Army's fake threat. By December 1944, the Ghost Army had conducted 12 operations. The pattern was consistent. Deploy inflatable equipment replicating division-sized forces, broadcast appropriate sounds, transmit convincing radio traffic, and create supporting visual evidence. German intelligence consistently reported the fake units as real, and German forces consistently responded by adjusting positions to counter phantom threats. The success rate was remarkable. Every operation succeeded in deceiving German intelligence, and not once did Germans realize they were facing inflatable equipment rather than real divisions. The operational risk was significant. Ghost Army soldiers often operated within 1,000 to 1,500 yards of German positions, well within range of German artillery and small arms fire. If Germans discovered the deception, they could have concentrated fire on the Ghost Army's actual positions rather than the inflatable equipment. But the deception always held. Germans bombed and shelled inflatable tanks, never realizing they were shooting rubber. The most dangerous moment came during Operation Koblenz in March 1945, when a Ghost Army team was setting up inflatable equipment in a field that German reconnaissance had under observation. A team member dropped an inflatable tank component and it bounced, something no real tank component would do. The team froze, certain they'd been exposed, but the German observer, watching from 800 yards away through binoculars, apparently didn't notice the bounce or interpreted it as something else. The deception continued, and German intelligence later reported a full armored division in the exact location where the bouncing tank had been deployed. Operation Viersen, March 18-24, 1945, was the Ghost Army's largest and most important operation. The mission, create the illusion that the U.S. Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine River at Viersen, while the actual crossing would occur 10 miles south at Düsseldorf. The operation required simulating 2 full divisions, approximately 30,000 troops with appropriate armor and artillery, in an area that was under direct German observation from across the Rhine. The Ghost Army deployed its entire inventory of inflatable equipment, 600 inflatable tanks, 400 inflatable trucks, 200 inflatable artillery pieces, positioned in fields near Viersen, in formations that matched how real divisions would stage for river crossing operations. Sonic units broadcast sounds of tank movements, troop activities, and preparation for assault operations. Radio operators transmitted traffic patterns suggesting division-level headquarters coordinating crossing preparations. Visual deception teams created fake supply dumps, command posts, and staging areas. The operation's timing was critical. The inflatable equipment had to be deployed at night to avoid German. Observation during setup had to be maintained for 6 days to sustain the deception and had to be convincing enough that German forces would commit reserves to defending Viersen rather than Düsseldorf. For 6 days, 100 Ghost Army soldiers maintained the illusion of 30,000 soldiers preparing for assault. German response confirmed the deception's success. German artillery bombarded the Viersen area continuously, firing thousands of shells at inflatable equipment. German aerial reconnaissance photographed the fake staging areas, and German intelligence reports identified 2 American divisions at Viersen preparing for Rhine crossing. Most significantly, German command committed 2 panzer divisions to defend the Viersen sector, pulling armor away from Düsseldorf, where the real crossing would occur. On March 24, 1945, the U.S. Ninth Army crossed the Rhine at Düsseldorf, encountering lighter opposition than expected because German forces had been diverted to Viersen. The crossing succeeded with casualties significantly lower than projected. Estimates suggest that 2,000 to 5,000 American lives were saved during the Rhine crossing because the Ghost Army had drawn German forces away from the actual assault point. Meanwhile, at Viersen, German artillery continued shelling the inflatable equipment for another 2 days after the Düsseldorf crossing began, still believing they were facing a real threat. When German forces finally discovered the inflatable equipment after Allied forces advanced across the Rhine, captured documents describe German officers' shock at realizing they had been fooled by rubber tanks. One German intelligence officer reportedly said, "We knew Americans were good at deception, but this is beyond our imagination. We bombarded toys while real divisions crossed elsewhere." The Ghost Army conducted 21 operations between June 1944 and March 1945, operating across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. The operations consistently succeeded in deceiving German intelligence, diverting German forces, and reducing casualties for real Allied units. Conservative estimates suggest the Ghost Army's operations saved 10,000 to 30,000 Allied lives by drawing German forces and firepower away from actual combat operations. The unit suffered remarkably few casualties considering they operated within enemy artillery range for 9 months. Total casualties, approximately 15 wounded, none killed in action. This was partially due to the nature of their work. Germans shelled inflatable equipment rather than actual Ghost Army positions, but also due to careful operational planning that kept soldiers dispersed and under cover, while inflatable equipment took the enemy fire. When the war ended in May 1945, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was quietly disbanded. The soldiers returned home to the United States, their service classified at the highest levels under provisions of the Espionage Act that prohibited them from discussing classified military operations. They were prohibited from discussing their war service, couldn't tell family or friends what they'd done, and received no public recognition for their contributions. The unit's records were sealed, classified for 50 years, on the grounds that tactical deception techniques might be useful in future conflicts, and revealing those techniques would compromise their effectiveness. For 51 years, from 1945 to 1996, the Ghost Army remained classified. The soldiers who had served in the unit lived ordinary lives, returning to careers in art, design, advertising, broadcasting, unable to discuss the most significant thing they'd done during their lives. The psychological burden of this enforced silence was profound. These men had contributed to saving thousands of lives through creative problem-solving and courage under fire. But they couldn't tell anyone. They couldn't explain to their children what they had done in the war. They couldn't attend reunions and share memories like other veterans. They couldn't correct histories of WWII that made no mention of their operations. Many family members didn't know what their fathers or grandfathers had done during the war beyond vague statements about special duties or classified work. Some family members assumed their relatives had worked in intelligence or code breaking, fields known to be classified. Others assumed the vagueness meant their relatives had done nothing significant and were embarrassed to admit mundane service. The reality that they'd operated inflatable tanks within artillery range of German forces to save thousands of lives was so unusual that even if they'd violated security to mention it, few people would have believed them. Jack Mazie, the fashion designer who had inflated tanks at Viersen, returned to New York and built a successful career designing department store displays and exhibition spaces. His family knew he'd served in the army in Europe, but had no idea what he'd done. When his son asked about his war service in the 1960s, Macy said only, "I worked with equipment. It was classified. I can't discuss it." His son assumed his father had worked on radar or some other technical system and didn't press for details. It wasn't until 1996, when Mazie was 76 years old, that he could finally tell his son he'd spent the war inflating rubber tanks. His son's reaction? "You're kidding, right? That sounds like something from a cartoon." Macy had to show declassified military documents to convince his son the story was real. Bill Blass, who became one of America's most famous fashion designers after the war, dressing first ladies and celebrities, built his career on a foundation of design skills he'd honed creating camouflage and deception during Ghost Army operations. For decades, journalists interviewed Blass about his design philosophy, his creative process, and his inspirations. He couldn't mention that his most formative design experience had been creating fake military installations, convincing enough to fool professional intelligence officers. When declassification finally came in 1996, Blass was asked if the secrecy had bothered him. His response, "Every day. I wanted to tell people that fashion design and tactical deception use the same skills, creating convincing illusions, understanding how people perceive things, paying attention to details that make something believable. But I couldn't say anything for 50 years. That was harder than the war." Harold Lehner, a painter who joined the Ghost Army directly from art school, returned to New York and built a successful career as an abstract expressionist. His paintings were exhibited in galleries and museums, praised by critics for their bold use of color and innovative compositions. But Lehner couldn't discuss the fact that his painting skills had been used during the war to paint realistic camouflage schemes on inflatable tanks, create fake unit markings, and design visual deceptions. When asked about his formative artistic experiences, he couldn't mention the most significant one: creating art under fire that saved lives. After declassification, Lehner said, "People think of war art as paintings documenting battles. My war art was camouflage that prevented battles by deceiving the enemy. That's more valuable than any painting I've done since." The deception operations that had saved thousands of lives were unknown to historians, excluded from military histories of WWII, and absent from accounts of the European campaign. Books written about the Rhine crossing mentioned the success at Dusseldorf, but didn't explain why German resistance had been lighter than expected. The explanation, that Ghost Army deceptions at Viersen had drawn German forces away, remained classified. Histories of the liberation of France mentioned Allied advances, but didn't explain how understaffed American units had successfully impersonated entire divisions. The Ghost Army's contributions were simply absent from the historical record. The burden wasn't just personal disappointment at lack of recognition. It was also professional frustration. Ghost Army veterans who went into military careers after the war, particularly those who worked in intelligence or deception operations, couldn't discuss their WWII experience with colleagues who might have benefited from learning those lessons. Techniques that had proven effective in combat couldn't be taught because the operations remained classified. Innovations in tactical deception couldn't be built upon because the innovations themselves were secret. Some veterans violated their security oaths in small ways, telling spouses or children fragments of their service without revealing classified details. These partial disclosures often created confusion. Describing inflatable tanks without explaining the full context made the service sound trivial rather than significant. One veteran told his wife he'd worked with balloon equipment during the war, leading her to assume he'd worked with barrage balloons or weather balloons, neither of which sounded particularly noteworthy. Only after declassification could he explain that balloon equipment meant inflatable tanks used in tactical deceptions that saved thousands of lives. The physical evidence of Ghost Army operations gradually disappeared. The inflatable equipment, classified as secret, was destroyed after the war, rather than displayed in museums or preserved for historical purposes. The sonic projection equipment was similarly destroyed. The radio deception equipment and techniques were transferred to intelligence agencies for potential future use, remaining classified even after the unit's operations were declassified. Photos and documents from operations were locked in classified archives. By the 1970s, very little physical evidence remained that the Ghost Army had existed beyond the memories of aging veterans who couldn't discuss those memories. A few veterans tried to get their service declassified earlier, filing requests in the 1970s and 1980s arguing that enough time had passed that revealing WWII deception techniques posed no security risk. The requests were denied. The Army's position was that deception techniques were timeless, methods that worked in WWII might work in future conflicts, so revealing them would compromise future operations. This logic meant the Ghost Army might remain classified indefinitely, and the veterans who had served in the unit might die without ever receiving public recognition for their contributions. Declassification began in 1996 when the Army released the 23rd's operational records, finally allowing former Ghost Army soldiers to discuss their service. Rick Beyer, a documentary filmmaker, learned about the Ghost Army in the late 1990s and began interviewing surviving members. His research revealed the scope of the deception operations and their effectiveness. In 2013, he produced The Ghost Army, a PBS documentary that brought the unit's story to public attention for the first time. The documentary revealed details that had been classified for 50 years: the inflatable equipment technology, the sonic deception techniques, the radio deception methods, and most importantly, the operation's effectiveness in saving lives. Surviving Ghost Army members, many now in their 80s and 90s, could finally discuss what they'd done and receive recognition for contributions that had been secret for half a century. In 2013, several Ghost Army veterans attended a reunion in Washington, D.C., meeting for the first time in decades to share memories and finally discuss operations they had never been allowed to mention. Jack Mazie, the fashion designer who had inflated tanks near Viersen, attended at age 93. He described the operation. For 50 years, I couldn't tell anyone that I'd spent the war inflating rubber tanks. When I finally could tell people, nobody believed. They thought I was joking or confused. I had to show them documentation to prove it really happened. But it did happen, and we saved lives by doing it. That matters more than people believing it. Another veteran, Bill Blass, became a famous fashion designer after the war, founding a fashion house that dressed presidents and celebrities. For decades, people knew him as a fashion icon, but had no idea that during WWII, he'd used his design skills to create convincing fake military installations using inflatable equipment and camouflage. When his Ghost Army service was declassified, Blass said, "Everyone assumed fashion designers couldn't contribute to warfare. We proved them wrong. Good design is about creating convincing illusions, whether for a runway show or a tactical deception. We use the same skills in both." The Ghost Army's legacy extends beyond WWII. Their techniques influenced modern military deception doctrine, demonstrating that tactical deception could be effective at the battlefield level, not just strategic levels. The concept of using inflatable decoys was adopted by multiple nations' militaries during the Cold War. The sonic deception techniques influenced psychological operations. The radio deception methods informed electronic warfare doctrine. The unit's effectiveness also demonstrated the value of creative thinking in military operations. The soldiers who served in the Ghost Army weren't traditional warriors. They were artists, designers, and technicians who applied creative problem-solving to military challenges. Their success proved that warfare wasn't exclusively the domain of combat soldiers, that specialized skills from civilian backgrounds could contribute critically to military success. The mathematical impact is striking. 1,100 men simulating forces of 30,000, operating for 9 months, conducting 21 operations, consistently fooling professional German intelligence, and saving an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 Allied lives. The cost-benefit ratio was extraordinary. The entire Ghost Army budget, including equipment and operations, was less than the cost of a single day's combat operations for a real division. Yet the Ghost Army's impact rivaled that of multiple combat divisions. In 2019, the U.S. Congress passed legislation awarding the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, Congress's highest civilian honor, recognizing their contributions to the war effort. The ceremony occurred in 2024, attended by surviving Ghost Army members and families of deceased members. The medal citation noted, "The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops conducted tactical deception operations with extraordinary creativity and effectiveness, saving thousands of Allied lives through innovative application of visual, sonic, and radio deception techniques." Jack Mazie died in 2020 at age 100, having lived long enough to see the Ghost Army receive recognition for work that had been classified most of his life. His obituary described his fashion design career, but emphasized his Ghost Army service. Mr. Mazie's greatest contribution was not the dresses he designed, but the fake tanks he inflated, which drew German fire away from real soldiers and saved thousands of lives. March 24, 1945, was when inflatable tanks at Viersen drew German forces away from the real Rhine crossing. 2:37 a.m. was when Jack Mazie inflated his tank. 22 minutes was how long inflation took. 100 soldiers simulated 30,000 troops. 6 days the deception lasted. 2 panzer divisions were diverted. 2,000 to 5,000 lives saved in that operation alone. 21 total operations across 9 months. 10,000 to 30,000 total lives saved. 51 years classified. 1996 was declassification. 2013 was when the documentary revealed the truth. 2024 was when Congress finally recognized them. One unit, 100 artists and designers, inflatable tanks weighing 85 pounds simulating 30-ton tanks. Sounds recorded at Fort Knox projected 15 miles, fake radio. Traffic fooling professional intelligence officers never detected once in 21 operations. Saved more lives than most combat divisions. proved that creativity in warfare works better than tradition when nobody expects it. Not because rubber tanks were better than real tanks, because drawing enemy fire to fake targets meant real soldiers didn't die, and sometimes the best way to win is to make the enemy fight illusions instead of men. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Your support preserves these histories of unconventional warfare that saved lives through creativity. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We honor those who proved that art and design could be weapons that saved thousands. Thank you for keeping their stories alive.